The Japanese Zero materialized from the jungle canopy like a phantom, its engine screaming as tracer rounds tore past my cockpit. I slammed the P-400 stick forward, diving so low that the Allison engine's roar echoed off the treetops below. At 50 feet above the jungle floor, with branches whipping past my wingtips, I rolled hard left and pulled the trigger. The cannon's thump, thump, thump vibrated through my bones as 20mm shells found their mark. The Oscar exploded in a ball of orange flame that lit up the green hell beneath us both. My name is Danny Graves, and this is the story of how we learned to make the forgotten fighter deadly. Port Moresby, New Guinea, September 15, 1942. The first time I laid eyes on the Bell P-400 Airacobra, I thought someone was playing a cruel joke. Sitting there on the coral runway under the brutal Pacific sun, it looked like a fighter designed by committee, and not a very good committee at that. The tricycle landing gear gave it an awkward, nose-down stance, like a bird pecking for worms. The engine sat behind the cockpit, which seemed backwards to every fighter pilot who'd ever lived. "Well, what do you think, Lieutenant?" Major Bill Caldwell asked, his weathered face creased with what might have been amusement. He was our squadron commander, a veteran pilot who'd somehow managed to keep most of us alive through 3 months of hell over New Guinea. I walked around the aircraft, running my hand along the olive-drab fuselage. The P-400 was supposed to be our salvation, Britain's unwanted export version Airacobras, shipped to us when the RAF decided they weren't good enough for the Battle of Britain. Now we were stuck with them in a theater where altitude meant everything, and these birds couldn't climb worth a "honestly, sir." It looks like it was built to fight the last war, not this one. Caldwell nodded grimly. The P-400 has a service ceiling of about 25,000 feet on a good day. The Japanese are hitting us from 30,000. He lit a cigarette, the smoke mixing with the humid air that clung to everything in this godforsaken place. "But it's what we've got, Graves, and we're going to make it work." That afternoon, I took my first flight in what we'd started calling the P-400 Nothing, as in, it could do nothing above 400 feet. The moment I left the ground, I understood the cruel irony of our situation. Below 10,000 feet, the P-400 was actually a decent fighter. The 37mm cannon mounted in the nose could punch holes in anything the Japanese flew, and at low altitude, the Allison engine gave us reasonable speed and maneuverability. The problem was that modern air combat happened high, up where the thin air gave fighters range and altitude advantage. Down low, where we had to fight, the Japanese could simply dive down on us from above, attack, then climb back up to safety. We were trapped in the basement while they owned the penthouse. But as I flew that first mission at treetop level over the Owen Stanley Mountains, something clicked. The jungle below was so dense it looked like a solid green carpet, broken only by the occasional river or clearing. If the P-400 couldn't climb to meet the enemy, maybe we could use the terrain to bring them down to us. September 22, 1942. The radio crackled to life as I patrolled at 8,000 feet along the Kokoda track, where Australian forces were desperately trying to hold back the Japanese advance toward Port Moresby. "Dragon Flight, this is Rebel Control. Bogies inbound, Angels 28, bearing 090. Looks like a dozen Oscars with bomber escort." I keyed my radio. "Rebel Control, Dragon Lead. We're at Angels 8 and can't get any higher fast enough. What's your suggestion?" A pause. Then, "Dragon Lead, you're on your own. Good hunting." That was the reality of flying P-400s in New Guinea. We were always alone, always outclimbed, always outnumbered. But that morning, as I watched the Japanese formation high above us like distant hawks, an idea began to form. "Dragon Flight, this is Lead. We're going down into the weeds. Follow me." I pushed the stick forward and dove toward the jungle canopy. The P-400 accelerated beautifully in the dive. This was what the Allison engine was made for. At 200 feet above the treetops, I leveled off and began following the winding path of the Loloki River. The Japanese formation was heading for Moresby, but they'd have to come back this way afterward. And when they did, they'd be low on fuel, probably spread out, maybe even cocky from a successful bombing run. That's when we'd hit them. 20 minutes later, I heard the sound I'd been waiting for, the distant drone of aircraft engines from the north. The Japanese were coming home. Dragon flight, hold position, and stay low. Let them pass over us first. Through gaps in the jungle canopy, I caught glimpses of the enemy formation as they flew overhead, single-engine fighters and twin-engine Betty bombers, all heading north toward their bases in the Bunagona area. They were flying at about 10,000 feet, probably feeling safe now that they were away from our supposed air defenses. But as the last aircraft passed over, I saw what I'd been hoping for. 2 Japanese fighters had dropped lower to investigate something on the ground. They were down to maybe 5,000 feet and still descending. Dragon 2, Dragon 3, you see those 2 Oscars breaking away from the formation? Roger led. They're coming down to our level. That's right. And they don't know we're here. Dragon 2, take the left one. Dragon 3, take the right. I'll cover you both. The ambush worked perfectly. As the 2 Japanese fighters descended into the river valley, we popped up from the jungle like deadly surprises. My wingman caught the Oscars completely off guard. The Japanese pilots never even saw us coming. Both enemy fighters went down in flames within seconds, crashing into the green maze below. But the real lesson came a few minutes later, when the rest of the Japanese formation realized what had happened and came diving down to investigate. Suddenly, instead of being trapped below superior aircraft, we were fighting an equal battle at our preferred altitude. The P-400's cannon was devastating at close range, and our aircraft's sturdy construction could absorb punishment that would down lighter fighters. In the 15-minute dogfight that followed, we shot down 3 more enemy aircraft while losing only one of our own. For the first time since we'd arrived in New Guinea, we'd beaten the Japanese at their own game. That night, as I wrote my combat report by lamplight in my tent, I realized we'd stumbled onto something important. The P-400 might be a failure at high altitude, but down in the weeds, literally at treetop level, it could be lethal. October 8, 1942, word of our tactics began to spread through the squadron. Within 2 weeks, we developed what we called canopy fighting, using the jungle itself as both camouflage and tactical advantage. We'd patrol at extremely low altitude, following rivers and valleys, staying hidden beneath the green canopy until Japanese aircraft came within range. The key was patience. Instead of climbing to meet enemy formations, we'd let them pass over us, then attack stragglers or aircraft that ventured too low. We became masters of the ambush, striking from the jungle like aerial guerrillas. The Japanese began calling our sector the Valley of Death. Their pilots started reporting mysterious attacks by fighters that seemed to appear from nowhere, strike with devastating cannon fire, then disappear back into the jungle. Intelligence reports suggested they thought we had some new type of camouflaged aircraft. If they only knew we were flying the same rejected fighters the British didn't want. On October 8th, we got our biggest test yet. Intelligence reported a major Japanese bombing raid forming up at Rabaul, at least 30 aircraft heading for Port Moresby, including some of their best pilots. Our entire squadron of 12 P-400s was scrambled to intercept. As we climbed away from Port Moresby, I looked back at the dust and smoke rising from our primitive airfield. Below us lay the Owen Stanley Mountains, their peaks shrouded in perpetual clouds. Somewhere up there, Australian infantry were fighting a desperate ground campaign to keep the Japanese from capturing our base. If Moresby fell, Australia itself would be in danger. We couldn't let that happen. At 15,000 feet, we spotted them, a massive formation of aircraft approaching from the northeast. Even from this distance, I could count at least 20 single-engine fighters and a dozen twin-engine bombers. They were flying in perfect formation at 25,000 feet, well above our maximum effective ceiling. Dragon flight, this is lead. Remember the drill. We go low and wait for our chance. I pushed the stick forward and led my formation down into the jungle valleys east of Port Moresby. At 500 feet, we spread out along the most likely return route for the Japanese formation. Then we waited. The bombing raid lasted 45 minutes. We could hear the explosions in distance as the Japanese pounded our airfield and harbor facilities. My hands gripped the controls tighter with each distant rumble. Every bomb that fell meant dead friends, destroyed supplies, and a weaker defense for the entire theater. But our discipline held. We stayed hidden, engines idling, waiting for the enemy to come to us. Finally, I heard them, the sound of aircraft engines echoing through the valley from the south. The Japanese were heading home, and this time some of them were flying lower, probably taking photos of the bomb damage or looking for targets of opportunity. Dragon flight, bogies approaching from the south. Looks like they're spread out and down to our level. This is it. What happened next was the most intense 15 minutes of my war. The first Japanese fighters came into view as they followed the Laloki River Valley toward the coast. They were flying in loose formation at about 3,000 feet, still higher than us, but low enough that we could reach them if we timed it right. I waited until the lead Japanese aircraft was directly overhead, then pulled back on the stick and climbed straight up through a gap in the canopy. The P-400 clawed its way upward, the Allison engine roaring at maximum power. At 2,000 feet, I had a perfect deflection shot at a Ki-43 Oscar that was banking to follow the river. The 37mm cannon bucked against its mounts as I squeezed the trigger. The high explosive shells tore into the Oscar's wing root, and the entire aircraft disintegrated in a ball of flame and aluminum fragments. The pilot never had a chance to bail out, but now the element of surprise was gone. The remaining Japanese fighters scattered in all directions, some climbing desperately for altitude while others dove toward the deck to meet us head-on. Dragon 2, Oscar coming down near 6 o'clock. I see him, lead, breaking left. The radio chatter became constant as 12 individual dogfights erupted across the valley. This was where months of low-altitude practice paid off. We knew every ridge, every river bend, every clearing in this part of New Guinea. The Japanese were fighting blind in unfamiliar terrain. I rolled the P-400 into a knife-edge turn around a jungle-covered hill and found myself behind another Oscar. The Japanese pilot was good. He jinked left and right, using the terrain to try to shake me, but he made the mistake of diving into a river valley with no exit. I followed him down until we were both flying at 50 feet above the water, our prop wash kicking up spray from the surface. At 200 yards, I opened fire. The cannon shells walked up the river toward the Oscar like deadly footsteps. The first shell hit the water just behind his tail. The second struck his fuselage. The third and fourth shells hit the engine, and the Oscar simply ceased to exist, replaced by an expanding cloud of fire and metal that scattered across the jungle. Somewhere to my left, Dragon 4 was in trouble. I could see him turning desperately as two Oscars closed in from different angles, their machine guns winking like deadly fireflies. Dragon 4, climb. Get some altitude. Can't shake them, lead. They're all over me. I banked hard left and dove toward the dogfight, pushing the P-400 past its red line speed. At 300 miles per hour, the controls felt like they were set in concrete, but I managed to line up behind one of the Oscars pursuing my wingman. The Japanese pilot saw me coming and pulled up sharply, trying to climb away from my guns. But the P-400, for all its faults, was built like a tank. I followed him straight up, pulling G-forces that would have torn the wings off a lighter aircraft. At the top of his climb, the Oscar stalled and hung motionless for a split second. That was all I needed. The 37mm cannon fired once, twice, 3 times. The explosive shells hit the Oscar's cockpit area, and the fighter simply folded in half before spinning down into the jungle below. Dragon 4 was clear, but the battle was far from over. More Japanese fighters were diving down from altitude as word of the ambush reached the main formation. Soon we'd be outnumbered 3-1. All Dragon aircraft, this is lead. Time to go. Head for the deck and use the terrain. Don't try to climb, they'll pick us off one by one. What followed was a running battle through the valleys and ridges of eastern New Guinea. We used every trick we'd learned over the past month, diving behind ridgelines to break visual contact, popping up from behind hills for surprise attacks, using river valleys as natural cover. The Japanese had superior numbers and altitude, but we had local knowledge and aircraft that could absorb tremendous punishment. The turning point came when Lieutenant Mike Romano in Dragon 7 managed to get behind a Japanese formation leader. The Oscar was painted in distinctive green and yellow camouflage with red wing stripes, obviously a senior pilot or squadron commander. Romano's cannon fire hit the Oscar's fuel tank, and the explosion was so violent it took out a second Japanese fighter flying in close formation. With their leader gone, the Japanese formation began to lose cohesion. Individual pilots started making mistakes, diving too low in pursuit of kills or breaking formation to chase single P-400s into box canyons where we could turn and fight on equal terms. 20 minutes after it started, the dogfight was over. The surviving Japanese aircraft climbed back to altitude and headed north toward their bases, leaving the valley floor littered with wreckage and smoke. We lost 3 P-400s that day, but we'd shot down 9 confirmed Japanese aircraft, with 3 more listed as probable kills. More importantly, we'd broken up a major bombing raid and sent a clear message. The skies over New Guinea were no longer a free fire zone for the Japanese. As I flew back to Port Moresby at 500 feet, following the familiar route through the river valleys, I couldn't help but think about the pilots we'd lost. Dragon 9 had gone down early in the fight, his aircraft hitting a ridge while trying to evade an Oscar at low altitude. Dragon 11 had been shot down over the jungle. We'd seen his parachute, but in that green maze, rescue was nearly impossible. Dragon 3 had made it almost back to base before engine failure forced him to crash land in a clearing 10 miles short of the runway. 3 good men, gone in 15 minutes of combat. And for what? To defend an airstrip carved out of a malarial jungle on the far side of the world? But as I approached Port Moresby and saw our ground crews already working to patch battle damage on the returning aircraft, I knew the answer. We were holding the line. Every Japanese bomber we shot down was one that couldn't attack Australia. Every enemy fighter pilot we killed was one less threat to the merchant ships bringing supplies to keep our forces alive. The P-400 might have been Britain's unwanted reject, but we'd turned it into something the Japanese respected and feared. In the hands of pilots who understood its limitations and strengths, the P-400 nothing had become a deadly jungle fighter. Over the next 3 months, our tactics spread to other P-400 squadrons throughout the Pacific. Units in the Solomons, the Philippines, and even Burma began using low-altitude ambush tactics with remarkable success. The aircraft that had been written off as obsolete suddenly found new life as a ground attack and air superiority fighter in specific conditions. November 30th, 1942, by late November, the strategic situation in New Guinea had changed dramatically. The Japanese offensive toward Port Moresby had been stopped cold, and Australian ground forces were beginning to push back along the Kokoda track. Our constant air attacks had worn down enemy air strength to the point where they could no longer maintain air superiority over the battlefield. But the Japanese weren't finished. Intelligence reports indicated they were massing aircraft at Rabaul for one final, decisive air offensive. If successful, it would crush Allied air power in New Guinea and allow them to resume their advance toward Australia. On November 30th, radar stations reported the largest Japanese formation yet detected approaching from the northeast, over 60 aircraft including fighters, bombers, and even some of their new Tony interceptors. Every available P-400 in the theater was scrambled to meet them, along with a few P-38 Lightnings that had recently arrived from Australia. I was leading the largest formation I'd ever commanded, 24 P-400s from 3 different squadrons. We'd briefed the mission carefully. Instead of our usual small unit ambush tactics, we were going to fight a conventional battle using our numerical advantage and local knowledge to defeat the enemy through coordinated attacks. The plan was complex but simple in execution. The P-38s would engage the Japanese fighters at high altitude, drawing them away from the bombers. Meanwhile, our P-400s would attack the bomber formation from below, using the jungle as cover until the last possible moment. As we climbed away from Port Moresby, I looked back at my formation. 24 aircraft spread across the sky in loose combat formation, their olive drab paint schemes almost invisible against the jungle background below. These were seasoned pilots now, veterans of dozens of low-altitude dogfights. They knew their aircraft and they knew the terrain. More importantly, they'd learned to fight as a team. At 12,000 feet, we spotted the enemy formation. It was everything intelligence had promised and more, a massive aerial armada that seemed to fill the entire sky. Twin-engine Betty bombers flew in tight formation, surrounded by layers of fighter escorts. Above and behind them, the new Tony interceptors prowled like sharks, ready to dive on any Allied fighter that got too close. Red flight, blue flight, this is Dragon-led. Execute Plan Charlie. Red flight takes the left side of the bomber formation. Blue flight takes the right. Green flight provides top cover. Remember, one pass and get out. Don't stick around to admire your work. Dragon-led, this is Lightning-led. We've got the high fighters. Good hunting down there. I watched as the P-38s climbed toward the Japanese fighter screen, their twin-engine silhouettes unmistakable against the tropical sky. They'd have their hands full with those Tonys, but their job was to buy us time for one clean pass at the bombers. At 8,000 feet, I led my formation down into the familiar embrace of the jungle canopy. We spread out along a 20-mile front, hidden beneath the green maze until the Japanese bombers passed overhead. Then we'd climb straight up through the canopy and hit them from below, the one direction they wouldn't expect attack. The wait seemed endless. Through gaps in the jungle cover, I could see the aerial battle developing high above as the P-38s engaged the Japanese fighter screen. Contrails streaked across the blue sky, and occasionally a burning aircraft would spiral down through the cloud layers. Then I heard them, the deep rumble of multiple aircraft engines approaching from the northeast. The bomber formation was right on schedule. All Dragon aircraft, stand by. Bogies overhead in 30 seconds. Through a break in the canopy, I caught a glimpse of the enemy formation passing over us. The Betty bombers looked huge from below, their bomb bay doors already open for the attack on Port Moresby. Fighter escorts flew close formation on both sides, their pilots scanning the sky for threats from above or from the sides. None of them were looking down. Dragon lead to all flights. Execute, execute, execute. 24 P-400s climbed straight up through the jungle canopy like deadly flowers blooming from the green hell below. We emerged into sunlight at almost point-blank range from the bomber formation, climbing at maximum power with our guns already trained on target. The Japanese were caught completely off guard. Their bomber crews had been focused on the navigation to Port Moresby, while their fighter escorts were watching the P-38s battling high above. Nobody expected an attack from the jungle floor. My first burst caught a Betty bomber in the starboard engine. The 37mm shells tore the engine clean off the wing, and the big bomber rolled over and dove toward the ground, trailing fire and smoke. To my left, Dragon 2 and Dragon 3 attacked another Betty in perfect coordination, their cannon fire converging on the cockpit area until the entire nose section simply disintegrated. But this time, the Japanese didn't break and run. These were experienced crews on what they knew was a critical mission. The bomber formation tightened up and continued toward Port Moresby, while their fighter escorts dove down to engage us. What followed was the largest air battle in New Guinea's history. 60 Japanese aircraft and 36 Allied fighters scattered across 100 square miles of sky, fighting individual duels while the main formations maneuvered for advantage. The radio chatter was constant: position reports, warnings, calls for help, victory claims. I found myself in a turning fight with 2 Japanese Oscars, using every trick I'd learned over the past 3 months. The P-400 couldn't outturn the lighter Japanese fighters, but it could outdive them and absorb far more battle damage. When one Oscar got behind me, I dove straight down toward the jungle canopy, pulling out at the last second and using the terrain to break visual contact. The second Oscar made the mistake of following me too low. As he pulled up from his dive, I was waiting behind a jungle-covered ridge. One burst from the 37mm cannon, and he joined the growing collection of wreckage scattered across the valley floor. The battle raged for 45 minutes before the Japanese formation finally broke off and headed north. We'd shot down 18 enemy aircraft confirmed, with 12 more listed as probable kills. But the cost had been heavy. We lost 8 P-400s and 3 P-38s, with several more aircraft so badly damaged they'd never fly again. As I led the survivors back to Port Moresby, I could see smoke rising from the airfield where a few Japanese bombers had gotten through our screen. But the base was still operational, and most importantly, the enemy's final offensive had been shattered. They'd never again have the strength to threaten Port Moresby from the air. December 15, 1942, the war in New Guinea continued for another year, but November 30th marked the end of Japanese air superiority over the theater. Without control of the skies, their ground offensive collapsed, and by early 1943, Allied forces were pushing them back toward their original bases. I flew my last combat mission in a P-400 on December 15, 1942. By then, newer aircraft were arriving: P-38s, P-47s, and eventually the magnificent P-51 Mustang. The Bell Airacobra's brief moment in the spotlight was over, but it had served with honor when honor was desperately needed. As I taxied my scarred and patched P-400 to the revetment for the last time, I thought about the lessons we'd learned in those desperate months. We'd taken an aircraft that everyone said was obsolete and found a way to make it deadly. We'd adapted our tactics to terrain and the enemy, turning our weaknesses into strengths. Most importantly, we'd held the line when holding the line meant everything. The P-400 never got the recognition it deserved. Military historians would remember the P-51s and P-47s that won the air war over Europe, or the F-4U Corsairs and F-6F Hellcats that dominated the Pacific carrier battles. Few would remember the rejected British fighters that learned to fight in the jungle canopy over New Guinea. But I remember. I remember the sound of that Allison engine at full power as we climbed through the jungle canopy toward an unsuspecting enemy. I remember the thump of the 37mm cannon and the flash of exploding Japanese aircraft. I remember the friends we lost and the victories we won with aircraft that weren't supposed to be able to win at all. The P-400 couldn't fly high, that much was true. But in the green hell of New Guinea, where the war was won and lost at treetop level, it was exactly the fighter we needed. Good thing we fought low. In the end, our little squadron of unwanted fighters had achieved something remarkable. Between September and December 1942, P-400 squadrons in New Guinea shot down over 150 confirmed Japanese aircraft while losing 89 of their own. More importantly, we'd helped break the back of Japanese air power in the Southwest Pacific at a critical moment in the war. The human cost was harder to calculate. Of the 36 pilots who flew P-400s in my squadron during those 4 months, 14 never made it home. They lie buried in military cemeteries across New Guinea, or in unmarked jungle graves where their aircraft went down in that green maze. But their sacrifice meant that Australia remained free, that the island-hopping campaign could begin, and that Japan's southern expansion was finally stopped. The P-400's moment in history was brief but crucial, the unwanted fighter that learned to fight where it mattered most. So Messi wonder what those Japanese pilots thought as they saw us climbing out of the jungle canopy, guns blazing and engines roaring. In their final moments, did they realize they'd been beaten by an aircraft their own intelligence had dismissed as obsolete? The P-400 couldn't fly high, but when the fate of the free world hung in the balance, high didn't matter. All that mattered was that we could fight and win where the fighting needed to be done. In the trees, in the valleys, in the green hell of New Guinea, where forgotten fighters learned to roar.